Hi, thanks for joining me today. Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. I bet you've heard of Hugh Ross. I've done some podcasts on him in the past, and he's an interesting person. Stirs up some controversy, I'll say that. And I'm not sure everybody believes everything that he says or understands it all, because he can be pretty difficult to get through in some places. But he's an astronomer and he's a pastor. And the reason I talk about not everybody agreeing with him is that he takes a position regarding the age of the Earth. He thinks the Earth has been here an extremely long time. So he's considered an older Earth creationist as opposed to a young Earth creationist. So some people will get upset at that, but I tell you, he's a nice person. I've had a chance to talk to him. He's come to our church, and a very kind individual. And so it's interesting to see the controversy that can get stirred up around somebody who's actually very pleasant, very nice. He doesn't seem to be the one that stirs up the controversy. It's other people who react to him. But anyway, he's got a book here that I want to, well, I've already done one podcast on it in the past, a long time ago. The book is called The Creator and the Cosmos, and I did a podcast that covered a lot of really interesting quotations that he had about the fine-tuning of the universe, how everything seems to be set up just right for people. So the previous podcast I did was when Hugh Ross had a lot of good quotations by people who now understand that there is a fine-tuning process to this universe. Everything seems ideally set up for life to be here. And he had a lot of interesting people talking about why they think there is such a thing as the fine-tuning of the universe and Earth, and even the small scale. So that was a long time ago. So I apologize, because there's so much in this book, and in this part of the book, they're really, in fact, most of this book, it's not really controversial. He doesn't spend a lot of time arguing for the age of the Earth. Mostly, he's looking at what has happened in the last, let's say, 20, 30 years, and people are starting to look at things differently as far as the universe coming into existence, how did it come into being. And they said whether you're skeptical of God's existence or seeking scientific support for your faith, this book will enable you to see how the heavens do declare the glory of God. So that's what it's about. I thought I would take two sections today that I find extremely interesting. I hope you do too. One is, what's been the reaction? Since now it's hard to deny the fact that the universe seems fine-tuned and the Earth seems fine-tuned for life. Everything seems exactly set up to give us, give humans a chance to live. So what do atheists, what do those opposed to this idea of fine-tuning, what's their response? And is there a response to their response? So we'll talk about that in a second. And if we have some time, I'd like to cover the multiverse as Hugh Ross discusses it, because that's also been kind of a position taken by the atheists that don't want to admit that things are finely tuned. So that's another kind of response. So let's take the first section. He says, let's see, we'll go to 149. He says, there are at least 10 reasons why the atheistic version of the multiverse does not eliminate the need for supernatural creation and a designing God. Now, maybe we should stop and talk about what he means by the multiverse. So he says some physicists have hypothesized that maybe during the cosmic inflation event, or before the universe was really, really tiny, just 10 to the minus 43 seconds old, that there was some kind of different quantum physics in play that allowed a space-time foam to form. And this foam, they suggest, these physicists, somehow budded an enormous number of baby universes. And every one of those baby universes would take on characteristics distinct from the others. And if you have an infinite number of universes, then you'd have every set of physical laws and every kind of value for the particles and all this kind of stuff. So if you have an infinite number of universes that have all these different possibilities, then these physicists say that you could have, without a creator, you could have our universe that's so finely tuned. So the argument is, if you have an infinite number of universes, anything is possible. So he said, all right, let's talk about that. He said there are 10 reasons why this really doesn't eliminate the idea of a designing God, but he said, I'm just going to cover 5. So here we go. Number 1, the timing is not coincidental. And this is a serious point. I thought this is great. He said, nobody came up with the multiverse idea. Nobody thought it was a decent proposition as an alternative to a personal God until the non-theistic scientists, ones who are not believing in God, had no other choice. I mean, for a long time, non-theists had argued, there's not much design in the universe. And if there's a little bit of design, it's not that remarkable. It's inferior to the work of a Christian God. But now, the current knowledge and understanding of the universe makes those kinds of claims seem pretty shaky. Paul Davies, who's, I would say he's probably, if he's not an atheist, he's certainly agnostic, but in his book, he said, there is for me powerful evidence that there's something going on behind it all. The impression of design is overwhelming. He said, now when did non-theists come up with the idea of the multiverse? Only when they couldn't claim that they couldn't come up with any other explanation for all the fine-tuned designs in the universe. It's become, in the last 20, 30 years, so overwhelming. They're now desperate and they're clutching at something, so they came up with the multiverse. Here's a second thing that he says causes us to question the whole idea of the multiverse. He said, the multiverse explains too much. He said it provides, it's a hypothesis, it provides for all possible outcomes. He says, if a hypothesis can explain everything, then it really doesn't explain anything. No experiment or observation could possibly falsify any of its explanations. Okay. Here's the third thing he says gives us pause to look at the idea of a multiverse. We see overwhelming design evidence on all observable scales. He says it's not just the universe as a whole that shows design, all the components of the universe. So he said, if you look at our galaxies, the clusters of galaxies, he said, you look at our galaxy, the Milky Way, look at our solar system. Notice he's getting smaller and smaller here. Our planet, Earth's surface environment, plants and animals, down to cells and molecules, atoms, even down to fundamental particles. He said, everywhere we look at each of these size scales, we see over and over again evidence for exquisite and pervasive fine-tuned designs. Now, I think about, have you seen any of these computer illustrations of what's going on in the cell? Wow. One was called, I think, Voyage Inside the Cell. And you see these proteins doing their thing, and they're marching across microtubules, and it just looks like a factory. Anyway, so he says, the evidence for purposeful design mounts when you look at all these different levels of size. Here's a fourth reason not to be impressed by the idea of the multiverse. He says overwhelming design is seen in all time scales. Well, that's interesting. Here's Freeman Dyson. He's a physicist. He said, the more I examine the universe, the more evidence I find that the universe, in some sense, must have known we were coming. So he says, as astronomers look further and further into the sky, they're actually looking back in time, aren't they? And he says what they note is that the universe is step-by-step designed and prepared for the entry of human beings. So it's for billions of years of time. And then his final argument against the multiverse says it fails its one testable property. He says it's just speculative metaphysics. You can't test it. He said, but he said there is a possible way to test this atheistic version of the multiverse. So he says, all we have is our own observable universe. Just look at it in more detail. If that detailed examination reduces the evidence of fine-tuned design for the benefit of us, then that suggests the non-theistic model of the multiverse. But he says, on the other hand, if the more detailed examination dramatically increases the evidence of fine-tuned design for our benefit, that outcome would favor the conclusion that intelligent, powerful, and a caring designer manufactured the universe so that we could be here. So I think he's made some good points there about the multiverse. Somebody also, this is not Hugh Ross, but somebody else suggested this. The multiverse is going to require some kind of machinery that not only produces a universe and not only produces a bunch of universes, but it would have to, how do we say it? It would have to introduce every universe with slightly different properties, almost like having a bunch of dials, and you turn one dial just a little bit and you create a universe. And you turn a second dial just a little bit differently and you create another universe. So where are all these dials coming from and being turned in exactly a precise way to create all these possible universes? I think that's a good argument. So the multiverse would even have to be designed. All right, so that's his discussion about multiverses. Then on page 181, let me get there. Okay, so he said, when it comes to the finely tuned characteristics of the universe, which we just talked about, he says, non-theists are in a difficult spot because the evidence is so weighty and it's getting more powerful all the time. He says the evidence is concrete. You can't just brush it aside. So he said, you'll hear, he says, probably 5 major arguments that cover the replies to the idea of design. So here they are. Argument 1. Well, we wouldn't be here to observe the universe unless the extremely unlikely did take place. So in other words, the evidence for design is just a coincidence. The unlikely did actually happen. Hugh says, wait a minute. He said, that argument is fundamentally an appeal to infinite chances. He said, think of it this way. And he got this from Richard Swinburne, a philosopher. Suppose 100 sharpshooters are sent to execute a prisoner by firing squad. So he lines up somebody lines up the prisoner. You have 100 sharpshooters ready, aim, fire, and the prisoner survives. Not a single bullet hits him. The prisoner shouldn't be surprised that he doesn't observe that he's dead. If he were dead, he couldn't observe his death. But he should be surprised that he observes that he's alive. So in other words, the prisoner could obviously conclude that all the sharpshooters missed by some major unlikely chance. Maybe it's just incredible good luck. But he'd be more likely to think, the guns were loaded with blanks or they all deliberately missed. In other words, somebody wanted him to live. And so the rational conclusion to draw from the incredible fine-tuning of the universe is that someone, capital S, wanted us to live. Here's argument 2. Here's what a non-theist would say when they see all of this fine-tuning. The design of the universe is mere anthropomorphism. So what does that mean? Well, here's an astrophysicist named Joseph Silk. He says, this is silly. He said, can you imagine a flea is on a dog and it's thinking to itself, oh, the dog was designed precisely for my benefit. The flea's error becomes all too apparent once the dog gets a flea collar. All right, so here comes the rebuttal. Says, well, that argument ignores some key issues. Said, yeah, the flea is certainly self-centered to think that the dog was designed for it, but there's no reason to deny that the dog was designed for a purpose, or maybe several purposes. The flea collar analogy may argue more strongly for design than for lack of it. So it said, when we imagine a wide range of hosts that are suitable for the flea, each of them requires some kind of design to facilitate the flea's survival. So astrophysicists have been unable to invent hypothetical universes that are really any different than ours that can support human beings or any conceivable kind of physical intelligent life. Here's the third argument. Again, these are arguments from non-theists as they look at design. Design arguments are outside the realm of science, so you got to ignore them. They said, as an example, there's something called the National Center for Science Education and other groups. They've just said science is, quote, empirically based and necessarily materialistic. Materials cannot be allowed. And, quote, any theory with a supernatural foundation is not scientific. So they say, look, the design arguments imply some kind of supernatural intervention, even if you don't call it God, but we can ignore them because they can't be considered scientific. So he said, if you're affirming that science and theology are mutually exclusive, he said, that might be convenient for materialists, but it's untenable. Science is rarely religiously neutral, and religious faith is rarely scientifically neutral. So both science and theology frequently address cause and effect dynamics. Both of them deal with the origin of the universe, the solar system, life, and humankind. He says when it comes to causes and developmental processes and origins, we really only have two possibilities. Either something came about naturally or supernaturally. And so to dogmatically insist that you can't discuss or you can't even consider a supernatural answer, it's like demanding all humans have to follow only one religion. That's atheistic materialism. So he said, this is Hugh Ross, I find it ironic that in the name of religious freedom, certain scientific educational proponents insist on ridding our teaching and research institutes of any faith or worldview that dares to compete with their own. Good point. Here's his fourth argument, at least the non-theist argument, that order can come out of chaos. But he says, natural processes can't explain the exceptionally high level of design complexity that's in us or in the universe that makes life possible. So natural processes can't come up with a way to get this kind of high level of design. He says order can come out of chaos. No, not really. Argument 5, as we continue to evolve, we will become the creator designer. So here are two astrophysicists, John Barrow and Frank Tipler. They look for evidences of design, and they discuss the anthropic principle and all this kind of stuff. And what they came up with, what they favored, was something that's called the final anthropic principle. What they mean is that life that exists in the past and right now and in the future will keep evolving with the inanimate resources of the universe until it reaches a state that they call the omega point. And that's going to be some kind of entity, capital E, that has the properties of omnipotence and omnipresence and omniscience with the capacity to create. So the creator God doesn't yet exist, but we, and that we means all of us that are alive, and frankly all of life and even inanimate structures, are gradually evolving into God. And when that happens, this God will have such power that he can go back and create the entire universe billions of years ago. Does that make your head hurt? It does me. And later on, Tipler says, how's this going to happen? Well, it's going to be advanced computer technology. So he said, if you extrapolate the computer ability getting better every year, that millions of years in the future, humans can alter the entire universe, and they can create a God who doesn't yet exist. And he also felt that we would be able to resurrect every human being who had ever lived by recovering the memories that once resided in each person's brain. Wow. Well, Hugh Ross says it's hard to treat these ideas, this omega point hypothesis, seriously. A critic read the books by Barrow and Tipler and said this: what should we make of this quartet of WAP, SAP, PAP, and FAP, anthropic principle hypotheses? He said, in my not-so-humble opinion, I think the last principle is best called CRAP, the completely ridiculous anthropic principle. So you can call it crap. But he goes on, he gets serious. He said, okay, look, Tipler grossly overestimated the role of human memory in the future capability of computers. Yeah, they're going to get better, but the laws of physics have a predictable finite limit on future computer hardware. It says even that cosmic model that Tipler based his whole premise on is out of date. It says if Tipler's proposal were true, the better people comprehend game theory, the less idea that they would have of committing evil, but we're not seeing that at all. And then at the end of the chapter, I'll tell you, I find this fascinating. Frank Tipler, the guy that came up with all this omega point stuff, finally came to his senses. He converted to Christianity, and about 20 years ago, he published his book called The Physics of Christianity. All right, so we have covered two things today. One is the atheistic response to fine-tuning, one way being the multiverse, and then the 5 things that Hugh Ross talked about there. So you get an idea for Hugh Ross, I hope, from this podcast. He's not the easiest person to read, but challenging, and I think his stuff is really thought-provoking. I hope you feel that way too. So this book's called The Creator and the Cosmos. He has many other books. He's got a new one on Noah's flood. I think I've done a podcast on that. Maybe you find that even more interesting. But this one is about the latest scientific discoveries pointing to God. So he stayed away from Age of the Earth, which I think is a good thing because it just gets people upset for whatever reason. Anyway, thanks for being part of this today. Talk to you later.